Good evening. Thank you all for joining us for our third installment with Be Historic, Brian and Joyce. And so we're going to get started here in a minute, but I did want to let everyone know we are recording this. It will be on our website so that you can view it at any time. It will take us a few weeks to get it up there. The one from October 7th is in the final editing and will be uploaded shortly. So if you missed that one, you can check that one out in a few weeks on our website. And Be Historic said they'll also share it on their social media. So tonight we have Accidents and Tragedies of the CA&E Railway. And we also in a few weeks at the museum, and this one will be at the museum because it will be at our model railroad in the lower level, which is over 50 years old. Our model railroaders are actually going to talk about their Pioneer Zephyr, their CA&E trolley, and a few other pieces of their exhibits. And as a way to tie it in with our current exhibit, as well as to give more information about their model railroad. So that is on November 18th. Yeah. We also have on November 11th, a completely different topic. We are celebrating 100 years of a few different historical organizations with our partner, DuPage County Historical Society. And so they will be giving 3 awards to 3 organizations in the area that are over 100 years old. So if you'd like to join us for that, that's also a free program. You can sign up on our website for that as well on November 11th. So we'll let the Historic get started. Here's Brian.
Thanks, Michelle. Isn't that a cool photograph, by the way?
There's a postcard modeled after that. I've seen it pop up on eBay at times.
Yeah, it's a 1902 photograph, somewhere along the Aurora line, but it just shows the rural nature of the station stops along the CA&E, AE&C in 1902. I'm not sure if there's ever been a solid identification of that particular site. I think it might be Ferry Road, but that's just a guess. But in any event. So thanks again for everybody for coming tonight, spending part of your evening with us. Thanks to the DuPage County History Museum for sponsoring this talk, and to Michelle Budkova for all the work she put into putting these talks together. Also to the Park District for providing this room while the DuPage History Museum is being renovated. My name is Brian Osberg. This is Joyce Osberg. About 3 years ago, we started the Be Historic YouTube channel. We've produced over 60 videos at this point, focused on regional history and prehistory. We've done series related to the CA&E Railway. We've done a series related to Native American sites, to paleontological sites, the proboscideans, mammoths, and mastodons, and so on. And right now we're in an epic journey across northern Illinois and Iowa, pursuing disused stations of the Chicago Great Western. So if you've got some spare time, watch how many?
16.
We're up to 16 so far, so it's probably going to be 20, 25 in that series. So it's a long trip. There's a lot of stuff to cover. We're going to go through a lot of stories tonight. There's a lot of accidents related to the CA&E and the AE&C. We're only going to touch a small sampling of them. Some of the more pertinent ones, or some of the ones that represent certain aspects of the railway. And so we're not going to be covering all of that. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. If you have any questions or comments or great thoughts, please hold them to the end. If you've got a burning comment or whatever, then feel free to go forth with it. So we've done quite a bit of research associated with the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railway. And although we're not planning to go into detail about the history of the railway tonight, because we've done so in previous talks, we'll just give you a quick overview to level set before we set the stage for the various accidents and tragedies that occurred along the railway. The CA&E looks a lot like the IPP, right? The CA&E was an electric railway with about 60 miles of trackage between Chicago and the Fox River. The hub was in Wheaton. It had 3 major branches. The main branch which went from Wells Street in Chicago to Wheaton, the Elgin branch which went up to Elgin, of course, and the Aurora branch which went down to Aurora. And of course, two major spurs, the Geneva spur which came off of the Elgin, excuse me, the Geneva spur which came off the Elgin, and the Batavia spur that came off of the Aurora line. It originated in 1902 as the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railway, but went into receivership in 1919, came out of receivership in 1922, reorganized as the Chicago Aurora and Elgin Railway, and operated till 1957 for passenger service, 1959 for freight, before abandoning the right-of-way in 1961. So that's just a quick level set of the CA&E. So in the course of doing our research, one of the questions that kept coming up was, well, how dangerous was this railway relative to other railways at the time? And also a question we were often asked is, well, how dangerous was the third rail and how dangerous was the electric power associated with the railway? And so we set about trying to find out and answer that question. Our methodology was fairly straightforward. We just scoured through dozens of Illinois newspapers from 1900 to 1960, looking for any stories of accidents related to the AE&C or the CA&E, as well as any other railways that were in the area. And we used several digitized online newspaper archives. We supplemented that with going to various libraries, looking through microfilm. And this is basically the result. And the results are likely biased towards underreporting. In other words, the total number of accidents was probably underreported by perhaps 20–25%. We noticed that some of the newspapers picked and choose between the accidents that they actually reported. So the actual number is likely larger than what we were able to collect by going through all the newspapers. However, the relative number of accident types, which we'll talk about momentarily, was likely fairly accurate. In other words, we put more faith in that number than we did in the total number of accidents. And from this analysis, we concluded a few things. One, that the AE&C and CA&E had similar safety issues as most of the other railroads in the area. It was fairly commonplace for derailments, collisions, explosions in the latter part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. And it was indeed very difficult to pick up a newspaper on any given day of the week and not find a story of a railroad accident in the area. So those were fairly commonplace. But then regarding the CA&E in particular, how was that relative, or what was the sort of accidents that were occurring on the CA&E? And I think, as you can see from this little pie chart here, that the vast majority of accidents were related to collisions. Collisions with trains and pedestrians, collisions with automobiles, collisions with other trains, collisions with horse-drawn wagons, and so on. So on the order of 80% of the accidents were related to collisions. So the danger of the CA&E and the AE&C was very much related to getting hit by one and not getting electrocuted. About 20% of the accidents were electrocutions. But we do have to say that most electrocutions were fatal. It wasn't like collisions where you could survive that. Most electrocutions tended to be quite fatal. We also looked at accidents over time between 1900 and 1960 and asked the question, did it improve over time? And indeed, it does seem to have done so. There were many more accidents in the first few decades of the 20th century and injuries and deaths than there were in subsequent decades as you go on. And this is probably the result of stronger government regulation. Also, the result of the CA&E trying to preserve money in its pocketbook, because almost all of these accidents resulted in litigation, as you might guess. And the folks back then were as litigious as they are today, and there were lots of lawsuits for injuries or deaths. So I'm sure that the CA&E took that into consideration when it started to put in safety features such as warning bells and crossing gates and so on, and crossing guards that they started to do in the 1920s going forward. So in the process of examining and analyzing all of these newspaper stories that we collected, a lot of the pathos and human tragedy came through. You couldn't help but read many of these stories and be very saddened by reading them, especially the more you dug into them. You started to investigate further additional newspaper stories. You started to look into the lives of some of these folks. And it was very sad all the way around. But we thought it was worth sharing, not only for the human element to tell these stories, but also for the lessons learned and relearned over the decades. And I think, as you're probably all aware, many of the lessons that should have been learned, we still continue to do today. People still try to get under the railroad crossings, beat the gates, and so on. That hasn't really changed much in the past 100 years. So this is a map of the CA&E circa 1911. Arguably, this is when the railway was at its zenith in terms of prosperity. The only thing missing from this map was the Westchester line, which was built in 1926. But everything else was already in place. And so we'll just continue to use this map throughout our discussion. Today's discussion will focus on the three major branches as well as the two major spurs. For the main lines, we'll focus on accidents that occurred from Forest Park to Wheaton. We could discuss accidents going closer in, but I think we'd be here till midnight if we did that. So we're going to focus on Forest Park to Wheaton for the main line. So we'll start with the Elgin branch, highlighted in the red line there. The Elgin branch was more than 16 miles in length. It was the last of the three major branches to open in the spring of 1903. The other two major branches, the main line and the Aurora branch, had opened up in August of 1902, several months earlier. And again, although there were many, many accidents along the Elgin line, we're only going to cover a sampling of them tonight. And in general, when we talk about each of these branches and spurs, we're going to start at the terminal and work our way in towards the hub, Wheaton. And we'll do that for Aurora, the main line as well. So we start with the Elgin terminal. And this is perhaps one of the saddest stories associated with the Elgin branch. It's that of Alma Fisher, which took place near the Elgin terminal. Alma Fisher was a 15-year-old farm girl from Rutland Township, Kane County, who on Saturday, June 25th, 1910, made a train trip into Elgin, probably on the Belvedere trolley system that came into Elgin, to return her older sister's baby. The baby had spent the day on the Fisher family farm northwest of Elgin the day before, so she was returning her sister's baby. She was supposed to have returned home on the 9 p.m. train, but being a teenager, she was spreading her wings a little bit and did not do that. Instead, she met with some other young people near the train station and then ended up going to a picture show, a movie. The tales following that get very murky, and the police and newspaper reports tried to get at the heart of it, but they really weren't able to nail down exactly what happened after this. But she reportedly stayed near the terminal for the next few hours and well into the evening, and seems to have been pursued by a few young men who were also hanging around the terminal. And then later, just about midnight, and just about between the terminal and the National Street station, which was the next station to the south, a few miles to the south, she stepped out of the weeds in front of a southbound AE&C train and was run down by the train. The motorman later testified that he blew the whistle to warn her of the coming train, but she simply shrugged her shoulders before the train hit her and killed her instantly. Whoops, sorry. Sorry about that.
Sneak peek.
Yeah, a sneak peek. Now, this was a major story in the local newspapers for at least a few weeks after this. There were multiple young men who were interviewed and given the third degree regarding what had exactly happened, who may have played an indirect role in her death. But there did not appear to be any subsequent arrests or convictions related to these inquiries. Alma Fisher is buried in the South Elgin Cemetery. The next story going south is at Collingbourne. Collingbourne is right off of Raymond Street, I think as some of you might know. And this is the story of Donald B. Shedden, who was walking south along the AE&C railway line just north of Collingbourne on June 27, 1914. Now, Donald's uncle, John Shedden of Elgin, had himself been killed in a freak accident when his telephone line got crossed with one of the AE&C high voltage lines, and he was electrocuted years earlier. Now, Donald Shedden was then a university student, and he worked as a summer employee of the AE&C engineering department, summer intern basically. And as Donald Shedden walked along the southbound along the rail line, he didn't hear the train approaching behind him. Beneath the viaduct of the Chicago Northwestern, which is that photograph over there to the right, just as he was walking under that viaduct, he was struck by the southbound train and was killed instantly. And you can see from the map, this is a map, by the way, there's Collingbourne, a flag stop, in case you're wondering. Here's the CA&E railway line coming along here, the Chicago Northwestern coming along here. That's that bridge right there. But this is a bit of a blind curve. So the train was coming along here. He was walking along here, and when the train hit him. Now, likely in his defense, there was likely a lot of railway noise from the other railways. There might have been another train going by that hid the noise of the train bearing down behind him. Or there was a road bridge just to the north of this, right about here, that also might have obscured the noise coming from the train bearing down on him. So Donald Shedden is buried in the Bluff City Cemetery in Elgin. The next story takes us much further south. It's St. Andrews, which was originally called Schramer Road in the early days of the railway. And it's noteworthy that this is an example of an oblique crossing, which were often very dangerous crossings. So here you see Route 59, and this is the original railway, and it's at a very acute angle. And those tended to be very dangerous crossings, as we'll see through the course of the description of these various items. On October 3rd, 1946, Edna Mae Clark of West Chicago was driving along Illinois Route 59 in West Chicago with her two young sons, Frederick and Jimmy, as passengers. And when she was passing over the CA&E crossing, her car stalled. Now, it's noteworthy that these grade level crossings, they actually weren't grade level. Typically, you went up 1 or 2 feet and came down 1 or 2 feet on the other side. And car engines were more finicky back then, and carburetors tended to stall more on inclines or manual transmissions. I'm sure many of you have driven a manual transmission, I suspect, and know that when you're on an incline with a manual transmission, it can be rather dicey sometimes. In any event, her car stalled, and she was momentarily stuck on the train tracks when a single car CA&E train heading eastbound, so it was coming this direction, broadsided her car at speed, probably going 50 miles an hour when it hit her automobile. So she and her 4-year-old son, Frederick, were killed outright. They were both thrown from the car. Miraculously, the 18-month-old son survived the crash, which was pretty amazing. The wrecked automobile was thrown to the east into the station, and this was just a small wooden building at the time. And this is in the mid-1920s, what the Route 59 crossing looked like. I mean, just to emphasize the rural nature of these crossings. at that time, very lonely country roads. I believe that's the station right there. So it was a small wooden building. The wrecked automobile was thrown into the building. The car was on fire. The station caught on fire and burned to the ground. Again, it was a small building. But the obvious tragedy was the Edna Mae Clark and her son being killed in the accident. They're both buried in Glen Oak Cemetery in West Chicago, and you probably can't see it, but it shows the date of death of Edna Mae and her son as being 1946. The next is Prince Crossing, and there's actually 2 or 3 accidents related to Prince Crossing, and these first 2 we're going to talk about were related by one of the actors in both of these events. On Friday, November 7th, 1913, a gas-powered speeder was carrying 3 AE&C electrical engineers southbound around the curve near Prince Crossing. So this is a gas-powered speeder. It looks like a motorcycle with an outrigger. They were coming down this grade. This is coming down a grade going under the viaduct for the Chicago Great Western and coming around the curve to Prince Crossing, which was then called Ingleton at that time. In any event, they were going so fast that they lost control of the speeder as it went around that curve. And as the speeder overturned one of the men, Edward Chapman, this fellow here, he was killed instantly by the speeder rolling over him. The William Dunbar, who was the chief electrical engineer, also on the speeder, he was thrown against the third rail and he was severely burned, but miraculously he survived. And then the third engineer, Henry C. Eggers, was also seriously injured in the crash. Mr. Chapman is buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Aurora. But then the irony of this is that 3 years later, less than 3 years later, on July 24th, 1916, one of the survivors of that crash, Mr. Eggers, he was now a foreman of the AE&C construction crew. He was working on the power lines just overhead of that general area. And if you go there today, you can still see all of the power towers, the utility line powers that still exist back there today. He was working on those power lines, and he knew enough not to touch any of the high voltage lines. However, it was the middle of July. He was sweating profusely, and a few beads of sweat dripped down onto the high voltage lines, sending a high voltage arc through his body, and he was at least knocked unconscious. It's not clear, but he plummeted down 30 feet and fractured his skull, which killed him. He's buried in Wheaton Cemetery, and that's his grave over there. Also at Prince Crossing, another accident. This one involved the Chicago Great Western. And this is that same curve that we just saw a moment ago. And this is within hundreds of feet of the Prince Crossing station. 4 years later, on Saturday, January 3rd, 1920, during the morning hours, and just to explain this a little bit further. So again, this is the CA&E coming down a grade, going under a viaduct for the Chicago Great Western, and this is Prince Crossing Road, and there's the Prince Crossing station. So it's coming around a curve under the viaduct. The Chicago Great Western came along here, going over the CA&E. And this picture shows that quite well. You can see the Chicago Great Western line here, and the CA&E is coming around this curve towards the Ingleton Prince Crossing station. So on this particular day, the Chicago Great Western, or evening I should say, the Chicago Great Western had essentially parked a freight train along the track. And in the early morning hours, there was some jostling of the train. One of the train cars decoupled, derailed, and rolled down the embankment directly onto the CA&E line. Later that evening or early in the morning, an eastbound AE&C train rounded the curve, coming into Prince Crossing at a high rate of speed, because they certainly didn't expect anything to be on the track. And this would have been a blind corner as they were coming around here, the train car would have been hidden. And they plowed directly into that train car. The motorman, 53-year-old Absalom Beecher Hobbs of Wheaton, he was killed outright, as well as the 29-year-old Prince Crossing station agent, likely on his way to work that morning, Alfred Peter Anderson. The A&C conductor, Walter Blazier of Wheaton, he was also injured. Hobbs is buried in the Beech Grove Cemetery in Muncie, Indiana, and Anderson is buried in Bluff City Cemetery in Elgin. So it's kind of amazing, these kind of quiet areas today were actually the scene of some very brutal accidents back in the day. And we'll see that more and more. Very innocent looking intersections, some severe accidents occurred. So then we come up to Jewell Road as we're heading to the southeast. We come to Jewell Road, and on Saturday, August 31st, 1912, while on a drive with his father and uncle showing off his brand new car, Herbert Landon's automobile was struck broadside at a road crossing right here at Jewell Road by an A&C train traveling northwest at about 30 miles an hour. So I think people familiar with this intersection will know that this is Lincoln Marsh, and the train comes up out of Lincoln Marsh, and usually it's going at speed, 30 miles an hour or more, while it's going up that hill. And you're right on the road all of a sudden after you come up out of Lincoln Marsh. Landon's automobile was traveling east, just like that automobile in the photograph. That photograph was taken circa 1950s, 55. But that automobile is heading east, just like Landon's was. The train's coming up out of Lincoln Marsh, heading to the northwest, just like in the accident. Due to the force of the crash, the auto was completely demolished and hurled into a culvert alongside of the right-of-way, probably on the west side of the intersection. The bodies of all three men were hurled out of the vehicle 10 feet from tens of feet from the automobile. Herbert Batten Landon was killed. He was an affluent 44-year-old property owner from Elgin, along with his 72-year-old father, Charles Landon, and the uncle, Dwight K. Landon of New York, was also seriously injured. Some witnesses reported that Landon's car stalled on the crossing. Some reported that he was trying to beat the train. It's not entirely clear what the actual case was. The newspapers also reported that a large crowd convened on the scene of the accident, many people trying to help the injured, but many people collecting souvenirs from the crash. The burials for the Landons are both in the Bluff City Cemetery in Elgin. The final story we'll talk about on the Elgin branch, this was brought to our attention by one of our viewers, and indeed it was a horrific crash that occurred. During a snowy evening of February 16th, 1936, Arthur Hilborn, 33 years old, was driving his automobile southbound along Lincoln Avenue with passengers Helen Hilborn, this is his wife there, and his sister-in-law, was sitting in the back seat. Her name was Esther Heidenreich. She was a hairdresser. She worked in Wheaton. She was 28 years old. Arthur worked for the F.E. Wheaton lumberyard and coal company. He was a driver for them. He was also a semi-pro football player, or a softball player, I'm sorry. And he and his wife, Helen, had been married for about 11 years at this point. The crossing signals were said to be working. But Hilborn attempted to get across the crossing ahead of the approaching train. And as he crossed the tracks, an eastbound train going at a high rate of speed, coming up the hill again from Lincoln Marsh, slammed into Hilborn's car, throwing him from the vehicle immediately, while the mangled automobile was carried about 200 or 300 feet towards Wesley Street, sort of up that grade. With the two women in it trapped inside the car, and the reports are that their bodies were badly mangled. They were all found dead immediately with the crash when the bodies were found. The burials were in Wheaton Cemetery, and again with the Hilborn's grave, you can see that both of them 1936 for both of their dates of death. So now we're going to talk about the Geneva Spur, and Joyce is going to take us through that.
The Geneva Spur was built in 1909 and closed down in 1937. So it was only in operation for about 25 years, much less than the other 4 branches of the railway. The Geneva Spur branched off of the Elgin line a little bit west of Pleasant Hill Road in Winfield. And it was about 9 miles in length. On the morning of January, oops, did I go too far? Nope,
No, that's right.
it is right, okay. Oh yeah. Okay, on the morning of January 27th, 1922, a CA&E car train that had originated in St. Charles was speeding east along the Geneva line when it hit an open switch just east of Kirk Road. The train was immediately shunted onto a siding south of the tracks. It jumped the tracks and continued on for many feet before it finally fell over on its side and stopped. The passengers in the train were thrown from their seats, and many of them were cut by flying broken glass. Some of those passengers, there were 20 on there, 16 were reported to be injured. And of those, a few had to be transported to Colonial Hospital in Geneva. But what's surprising is that when the train was righted and put back on the tracks, the train and the majority of the passengers carried on to their final destinations. It's actually nice to have a nice story from one of these accidents. Okay. So late in the evening of January 12th, 1935, 36-year-old Sheriff's Deputy Edward Smoky Lang decided he was going to take a shortcut home on the Geneva line of the CA&E. Now, the Geneva line didn't have a whole lot of traffic on it, so many of the more adventurous locals would actually drive their vehicles along the trackway and take a shortcut home. They would drive up to the tracks on like Prince Crossing or High Lake and continue east, getting off at one of the side streets where they wanted to go. Yeah, wouldn't want to try that today. So anyway, Smoky Lang made it about a fifth of a mile east of High Lake Road, and his car broke down and his battery stalled, somewhere around the vicinity of the High Lake station. And about 1 o'clock in the morning, he's working on his car, trying to get it started, and he looks up, and there's a train bearing down on him from the west. Before he could do anything, the train hit him and his automobile. His car was carried over 100 feet down the trackway. He was found unconscious next to the line. He had a fractured skull, broken nose, and broken ribs, and was taken to the Geneva hospital. But he survived that. The Winfield Road Station, which is in the upper right-hand corner there, was located along what is now County Farm Road. And back in the early part of the 1900s, this was a very quiet rural road. The station itself was a flag stop. You can see the flag on the pole, the semaphore flag on the pole. And the station itself was just a small wooden structure. On November 29th, 1913, affluent local farmer, 31-year-old Peter Schramer, got off the CA&E train or A&C train it would have been at that time, at the Winfield station. And he thought he could quickly cross over the tracks in front of the train towards his home in Winfield. But he did not accurately judge how fast the A&C train cars accelerated, and he was hit and killed. The ironic thing about this is he was the nephew of Thomas Schramer, for who the AE&C had named the Schramer Road Station, which was St. Andrews that Brian talked about on the Elgin line. Peter Schramer's estate was valued at over $300,000 in 1913, which would have been over $4 million in today's money. And he is buried in St. John the Baptist Cemetery in Winfield. So Brian will now continue on with the Aurora branch.
Thank you. Right, so the Aurora branch. This was about 14 and a half miles in length, and it went from downtown Wheaton to downtown Aurora, and enabled you to travel all the way from downtown Chicago all the way to Aurora, just like the northern branch allowed you to travel all the way to Elgin. So again, we'll start towards the terminal and we'll work our way in towards the hub. So our first story is along Aurora Avenue. That merges into Broadway, I think, as many of you know, and it's also Illinois Route 25 today. A tragic accident occurred along the Aurora Avenue crossing in 1928, and you'll notice that it's another oblique crossing. Here is the Illinois Route 25 or Aurora Avenue, and here is the CA&E, which was a double track at that point. During the afternoon of June 3rd, 1928, Edwin May was driving his delivery truck from Batavia south, along with his 4-year-old son, Edwin May Jr., and 2 other boys sitting in the cab of the truck. They were traveling southbound along Aurora Avenue, and this is actually a photograph taken in the mid-1920s of that very crossing. So it gives you an idea of what it looked like. And actually, it doesn't look too dissimilar today. The road's a little wider, but it looks fairly similar to that today. Apparently, he didn't hear the train whistle or see the warning signals, and he proceeded ahead across the crossing. And in that moment, his car was struck by an Aurora-bound CA&E train traveling at about 35 miles per hour. So the train would have been coming in this direction. And again, this oblique angle meant that you would have to be looking way over your shoulder in order to see that train coming at a fairly high rate of speed. 35 miles an hour was a good rate of speed. This is back in 1928. As a result of the collision, Edwin May was found lying on the ground in a dazed condition, cradling his son in his arms, who had been killed in the accident. The other 2 boys in the truck had been thrown clear of the wreckage and suffered only minor injuries, miraculously. Edwin May Jr. is buried in Riverside Cemetery, Montgomery, Kane County, Illinois. The next story is about suicide, and there were many suicides along the AE&C and CA&E over the years. We're only going to talk about one of those tonight, I think. And we're describing this event primarily because it highlights the effects of bullying and intimidation, where people feel powerless and fall into despair, basically. The location of this event was at Deal Road, the Deal Road crossing, and took place on the afternoon of Wednesday, December 14th, 1938, just before the holidays. And it involved 28-year-old principal of Oswego High School, Melvin George Addig, who was a very young man to hold such a position. And that might have played into this. It's not clear. He was also a husband and the father of 2 children. And that particular day, he told his wife he was going out for a short drive and he'd be home in a short while. A short time later, he pulled up at the Deal Road crossing just at about dusk. And you can see this is again what that lonely crossing would have looked like back at that time. Very lonely rural roads back in those days. He pulled up to the crossing, he left his watch on the car seat, left his car keys in the glove compartment, and then waited by the crossing for a train coming eastbound. And when the train was but a few hundred feet away, he jumped between the tracks, put his arm over his eyes and ran towards the train that was coming down on him. He was killed instantly, of course. Subsequent inquiries into his death indicated that intimidation and harassment by some of the Oswego students, as well as their parents, as being a possible cause for his actions, which is still something that goes on today, unfortunately. His burial is in Oakwood Cemetery, Metamora, Woodford County, Illinois. Then we come to Williams Road. Williams Road, again, it's a very innocuous crossing, and you wouldn't think that there would be some very bad accidents there, but indeed there were. And again, this is probably another excellent example of this oblique intersection again. It's called Big Wood Road big woods road here, but this is Williams Road right here, and here's the CA&E going along here, and the Williams Road flag stop right there. But another example of an oblique intersection. In the early morning of October 22nd, 1913, an eastbound AE&C train moving at a very high rate of speed of about 60 miles an hour was coming out of the curve just right here. So it's just coming out of this curve. The train crashed into a large metal object that had been dropped previously by one of the work trains that had been doing work in the area before that, and jumped the rails at a very high rate of speed. It turned over many times and crashed into a ditch alongside the right-of-way, probably somewhere in this vicinity here, before breaking up into many pieces. This is back when most of the train cars were made out of wood at that point, so it was smashed into pieces as it turned over. The conductor, Martin P. Whitney, age 33, was killed when he jumped from the train attempting to escape, but the train rolled over him multiple times, crushing him and killing him. The motorman, William Fortmeyer, was also seriously injured in the accident. The burial of the Martin P. Whitney was in Chatham Community Cemetery, Chatham, Sangamon County, Illinois, so far south of here. Also at Williams Road, this is another ironic story. On Sunday, September 3rd, 1917, Florence B. Williams, age 49, was taking a drive with her companion, Daniel Newcomer of Naperville, when they approached the Williams Road crossing. Now, as most of the rural people that lived in these communities, they were very keenly aware of the train schedules. They knew them by heart because that's when that was their primary means of travel back at that time in 1917. But both of them had forgotten that it was a Sunday and the train schedule was different that day. So as they went forward towards the crossing, they were very surprised by the train when it bore down at them again at very high speed. Hitting their vehicle squarely, Florence Williams was killed outright in the collision. Daniel Newcomer was seriously injured. And again, you can see this lonely country road. It's still a lonely suburban intersection if you go there today. But back then it was an even lonelier place, a rural road there. So with some irony, the AE&C railway crossing and stop, as well as the road, was named for Florence Williams. So she was killed at the road in the station for which she was named. The Williams were wealthy farmers and landowners to the west of Warrenville. She had been engaged to Judge George Brown when he was an attorney in the 1890s, but the engagement was broken off in 1901. And it was broken off apparently because she was upset with how he handled the negotiations with the AE&C in purchasing the right-of-way property for her, part of her farmland. She did not think she got a fair deal out of it. So she broke off the engagement with George Brown, the attorney, who then later became Judge George Brown. And as it happened, he died 5 years later in 1906 and left her $10,000 in his will, which is a lot of money back then. It's about $250,000 in today's money. She's buried in Warrenville Cemetery in Warrenville. So if you're ever wondering where the Williams name comes from in Warrenville, it's from the Williams family that lived to the west of Warrenville. But perhaps the most horrific accident that occurred at Williams Road occurred in 1929. And again, you can see the oblique intersection. This is Williams Road here, and this is the CA&E Railway right here. This is an aerial photograph from about 1939. So in the late morning of July 23rd, 1929, 4 members of a wedding party, including the newlyweds, the best man, the bridesmaid, they had just previously left the wedding party to avoid hazing by family members or friends at the wedding. And they were driving in an automobile approaching Williams Road crossing from the south. So they would have been coming along right here. Unfortunately for them, there was a train bearing down coming from the east. The warning lights were on. This is in 1929, so there were warning lights for the intersection. The warning lights were coming on, the warning bells, but apparently they disregarded them in an attempt to beat the train. You can sort of imagine the scenario. They just came from a wedding. They were probably amped up a little bit and thought that they could, when you're young, you think you're invincible, and they thought they could beat the train. The train was coming at about 40 miles an hour. However, they misjudged the speed of the train, they misjudged the distance and their ability to get across the crossing. And the automobile was hit squarely by the train. All 4 passengers were thrown and killed outright from the violent collision, including the groom, Joseph Wojciech, I'm probably going to mispronounce the name, Wojciechowicz, age 24, a machinist from Chicago. The bride, so this is the groom. This is the bride, Lillian Olmsted of Chicago. The best man is that gentleman there, Joseph Kmiecik, age 24, also a machinist from Chicago, and Christine Libera, age 26, a clerk from Chicago. All 4 of them were buried in Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois, the location of the infamous Resurrection Mary ghost. And after reading the story, you sometimes wonder if they've got the wrong ghost. But again, you wouldn't think that these horrific accidents occurred at those lonely intersections. So then we get to Montview Avenue. Montview crossing is at Winfield Road. So today we call it Winfield Road, but at that point it was called the Montview Station, and it was named Montview for a family farm that was just off in this direction there. And the Montview Station was just about right there. So this is looking south along what is today Winfield Road. And it's much wider today, probably 6 lanes across, I'd say. But on Easter Sunday, April 4th, 1915, the Dirks family was out driving their automobile on a family outing. They were headed south to Aurora. Bruno Dirks, the gentleman in the lower right corner there, was driving. He came from Forest Park with his family. Helen Grunert Dirks, his 27-year-old wife, she's the woman at the top. She was sitting alongside him in the front seat. And in the back seat were her younger sister, Lydia, the photograph of the woman just below her, and her younger brother, Arthur, was also in the back seat. Now, witnesses to what followed said that most people that came up to the Montview crossing, which was completely unprotected, there were no warning signals at that time, most motorists would pull up to the railway tracks. They would get out of the car. They'd look both ways up and down the track. If there was no train coming, they'd run back into the car and then get across the crossing. That was the typical way of getting across many of these rural crossings at that time. It was reported, however, that the Dirks instead inched up to the crossing with the nose of their car, basically, and not hearing an oncoming train, probably because they couldn't hear it over their own motor noise. They decided to go forward, and just as they did so, a train came along and hit them square, a speeding train, probably again going 40 to 50 miles an hour. The force of the collision hurled the automobile tens of feet in the air, threw the occupants clear of the wreckage except one, Helen Dirks, who was trapped in the car. Miraculously, Bruno Dirks was thrown from the collision and was only slightly injured, but he staggered over to the wrecked car only to find that his wife had been killed by the collision with a fractured skull. Her 2 siblings, too, were seriously injured in the crash. A much more terrible accident occurred at the same Montview crossing some years later. Then in the late afternoon of October 1st, 1928, 2 sisters, Margaret Bollweg, age 21, and Helen Bollweg, age 19, were driving to their home in Warrenville after spending the day at their jobs in Wheaton, where they worked at the DuPage County Abstract Office, probably near the courthouse. Now, the Bollweg family originally owned one of the farms that made up the McCormick estate, which now has become St. James Farm. So the AE&C line used to go directly through the Bollweg family farm. They sold the farm in 1920 to the McCormicks, and they moved off the farm then at that point and moved into Warrenville. So it's again a bit of an irony that this family that was so tightly associated with the railway now are involved in this accident. As the two sisters drove along Winfield Road, it was drizzling out. They were not too far from home, probably driving south, although the newspapers didn't specify that. Their small sedan was struck by an eastbound CA&E train traveling 50 miles an hour at the unguarded Montview crossing. It destroyed the automobile and carried it more than 400 feet along the trackway towards Butterfield Road to the east. And worse, a spark from the shorted third rail lit the automobile's gas tank on fire. The train crew and passengers rushed to try to put out the flames, but it was of no avail, and the two young women trapped in the car were consumed in the blaze. They were burned beyond recognition. The two sisters are buried in St. Michael's Cemetery in Wheaton. And that photograph is what you can see what was left of their car after the flames were finally put out. So the last story about on the Aurora line is related to Wheatbrook Road, actually between Wheatbrook Road and Plomondon, roughly midway between those two places. And it took place mid-morning on May 19th, 1913. The Stewart family had just moved to Wheaton from Chicago 3 weeks prior, feeling that the country air would be good for their children, their three children, and be a better place to raise them. They moved temporarily into the Harry Hubbard Manor along Wheatbrook Road. So that would have been right here. This is the Harry Hubbard Manor. This is the CA&E line, and this is Wheatbrook Road right there. Originally, that was Warrenville Road. That morning, the Stewart children were playing in their large backyard, which backed onto the AE&C railway. And in a moment of distraction, the youngest girl, a toddler, 15 months old, ambled onto the railroad's right-of-way. In the distance, a train was coming southbound from Wheaton heading towards Aurora along the line, and they saw the baby toddling towards the train tracks at about 20 miles an hour or so. The motorman applied the brakes, blew the horn, but that only succeeded in frightening the child, and she stumbled onto the tracks as a result of the whistle. Moments later, the toddler was hit and thrown from the impact. The conductor and passengers jumped off the train immediately, picked up the poor child to bring her back to Wheaton for medical attention. And just then the mother rushed up just as they were taking the girl, distraught and beside herself, as you could imagine. But the little girl died shortly thereafter. These are very sad stories. So now we will talk about Batavia, which is a spur that came off of Aurora.
The Batavia Spur was built in the original 1902 construction of the railway, and it remained open until the railways closed in the late 1950s. The Batavia Spur branched off of the Aurora Brent line at Eola Junction, which also was known as Batavia Junction, and it was about 6 miles in length. Our first story occurred close to the Batavia terminal, about 700 feet south of the terminal. On a cold Saturday morning in February 8th, 1908, a group of children were sledding down the Adams Street hill about 700 feet from the terminal, and that hill sloped down to the Fox River to the west. Among the children was Carl Frey, the 7-year-old son of Henry and Angelina Frey, who had just recently moved to Batavia from Plainfield, Illinois. With the exuberance of youth and probably not really understanding the danger at the base of the hill, Carl Frey, I think I had said Henry Frey, it's Carl Frey, the 7-year-old son. He jumped on his sled and went down the hill, picking up speed as he went. As he got to the bottom, was racing across the snow, he looked up and saw a train coming from the left. He swerved his sled to try to avoid it, but he wasn't in time. The right side of his skull and his right arm were fractured by the train. Carl Frey died immediately and was survived by his parents and his older brother. Late in May of 1910, AE&C car left the Batavia terminal and headed south towards the powerhouse. On that train were three daughters of Chicago Episcopal Bishop Charles P. Anderson and his wife Janet. The three girls, aged 19, 7, and 4, were seated at the front of the train behind the 38-year-old motorman, G. Hamlet Cowdery. As the train approached the powerhouse, Cowdery noticed a coal freight car become loose from its mooring on a siding, and it rolled right onto the main track in front of them. Cowdery slammed on the emergency brakes, and he threw himself in front of the three girls to protect them. The three girls, when the train, two cars hit, the front of that passenger train was telescoped, just crushed in. The three girls, though, only sustained minor injuries, although one of them did have a broken leg, but considering that really wasn't too bad. Cowdery was severely cut by the broken glass, and he had a badly injured knee. The bishop and his wife strongly praised his heroic actions in saving their daughters, and they held a benefit luncheon for him that raised about $200, which in today's money would be about $4,000. Unfortunately, though, Cowdery never really recovered from his injuries. The severe lacerations he received ended up causing paralysis of his legs. And 22 years later, in 1932, Cowdery took his own life. The State Training School for Girls was located on the east side of the Fox River, a few miles north of Batavia in Geneva. This is a place where young women, often from broken homes, were incarcerated, sometimes for pretty minor offenses, and these included moral transgressions such as unwed pregnancies. In 1924, one such young woman was 20-year-old Sadie Kmiecik. She was pregnant when incarcerated in 1923 and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in September of 1923. In February of 1924, Elizabeth passed away. On July 24th, late in the evening of July 24th, 1924, Sadie Kmiecik escaped from the Geneva State Training School, and she wandered south and came upon the CA&E tracks in the vicinity of the Batavia powerhouse. Somewhere along the line, as she was following along the tracks, she stumbled and fell against the third rail and the running rail, and she was electrocuted and died instantly. The Batavia powerhouse night watchman found her body along the track in the morning. Sadie Kmiecik is buried in the Geneva State Training School Cemetery. There was another bad accident related to the State Training School and the electric railway. This one occurred 12 years earlier than the Sadie Kmiecik story. On September 6th of 1912, three teenage girls, Zoe Pretty, Viola Thompson, and Lulu Johnson, escaped from the State Training School. In a light rain and in the dark, they wandered through the woods for several hours, and they finally came upon a lonely stretch of this AE&C line between Hart Road and
Wagner Road.
and Rodant Road. The girls reasoned that if they followed along these tracks, that the trackways would lead them into Chicago, which was a good thing to think about. So they decided to follow the tracks. And as they were walking along, being teenagers, they started playing games, and they decided to use the rails as balance beams. So 15-year-old Zoe Pretty hopped up on top of the third rail, which was set higher than the running rails. and she reached out her hand to her two friends who were also already holding hands. When they all touched, the resulting massive shock killed Zoe Pretty outright. Lulu Johnson and Viola Thompson were thrown unconscious along the trackway. Lulu, when she awoke sometime later, saw a train bearing down on them from the east. She was able to drag Viola off of the tracks, but that westbound train ran over Zoe Pretty's body and mutilated her remains. Zoe Pretty was buried in the, and you might, she's in the, sorry, it's not on my notes there. Got cut off. It's in a cemetery in southern Illinois, that's why I can't remember. Oh, it's the Hurricane Cemetery in Cartersville in Williamson County. That's down around Carbondale. So, Brian will cover the last one.
Thank you. I think one of the points to be made about that is that these young women came from all over the state, and they would have been familiar with the workings of the third rail and so on. So, you wonder, well, why would they have been walking on the third rail? They wouldn't have known that. They came from the countryside in many places from Illinois. So that's one of the points to be made about that. So the final branch we'll talk about is the main branch, which went from Wheaton all the way to Wells Street in downtown Chicago from 1905 until 1953. However, again, we're only going to talk about Forest Park to Wheaton, again, in the interest of time. So we'll start in Forest Park, and we'll start with the Des Plaines River Bridge. And this was the site of numerous accidents over the years. Local people would use this bridge as a shortcut to get from one side of the river to the other. But you can see the way that the bridge is designed with two separate walled-in enclosures that if you were caught in the middle, there's nowhere to go except maybe over the side of the bridge. And I'm sure that happened on more than one occasion. It was also a place where people would, the cemeteries, Concordia Cemetery and Waldheim Cemetery are just over here on the other side of the Des Plaines River. And people would cross over from Concordia into Waldheim to visit the two different cemeteries, and they had to cross over the train tracks to do so. It should be noted that this bridge is a few hundred feet to the south of the present-day pedestrian bridge that goes over the Des Plaines River from Concordia. So you have to imagine the CA&E used to come a few hundred feet to the south over the Des Plaines River as it came into Maywood from Forest Park. In any event, at about noon on September 15th, 1907, a 50-year-old man, Fred Kruger, and his 15-year-old son, Edward, were visiting grave sites in Concordia and Waldheim cemeteries in Forest Park. And the pair were just then crossing over the train tracks from Concordia Cemetery to Waldheim Cemetery, just a short distance to the east of the bridge that you can see there. As they were doing so, they were struck by an eastbound AE&C train speeding at about 40 miles per hour. And their view almost certainly was obscured by the presence of the bridge. They probably wouldn't have seen, on the other side of the bridge, they probably wouldn't have seen the train coming as a result of the bridge being in their way. Both of them were hurled several feet into the air. Fred Kruger was struck from behind and was killed instantly. His son was badly cut and bruised about the head and body with internal injuries. And it was reported that Fred Kruger had used his body to shield his son, thereby saving him from the impact. An AE&C policeman was supposed to have been guarding the bridge as well as the foot traffic to the other side, but he decided to go home for lunch without permission when this accident occurred. And so he got into a little bit of trouble as a result of that. Next, we head into Maywood. There are many stops in Maywood, but this one's talking about the 17th Avenue crossing. And this particular accident's of interest because it involved the crossing guards. Now, the crossing guards were hired as full-time employees by the CA&E in in an attempt to reduce the number of automobile and pedestrian collisions that occurred with trains along some of the busier intersections in places like Maywood and Wheaton and elsewhere. The picture on the lower right is an example of one of those crossing guards nearby one of the crossing guard shacks where they kept warm in the winter and got out of the rain when it was raining out. On February 23rd, 1926, Thomas E. Gudgeon, a 55-year-old crossing guard and flagman employee of the CA&E, saw a car attempting to cross the tracks at Maywood 17th Avenue, which was right here. Here's the CA&E tracks. And so he was doing his job. He jumped into the road to halt the automobile driven by W.K. Kavanaugh, a salesman. And he succeeded in stopping the car in time, thereby saving the man's life. However, a small part of the car was still in the way of the train as it crossed by. And when it hit that small part of the car, it slammed the automobile into the crossing guard who was standing right next to the car at that time, killing him. Gudgeon left a wife, Cornelia, and he's buried in Mount Carmel Catholic Cemetery in Hillside. So as we head west, we come to Butterfield Road. And again, we're at one of those oblique crossings. So here's the CA&E running this way. Here's 56 running this way at an oblique angle once again. And Butterfield Road, as a result, was another very dangerous crossing, the site of multiple deadly accidents over the years. This is right between Bellwood and Hillside. You can just see that perhaps on the map. And in this particular case, this is 1908, a little after 4 p.m. on April 9th, 1908. 4 women were returning from a funeral at Oak Ridge Cemetery, which would have been south. So they were moving north in a horse-drawn carriage driven by a driver. As their carriage passed over the crossing at Butterfield Road, heading north, an A&C train moving at a speed of 60 miles an hour, this is 1908, bore down upon them from the east. So the train is coming this direction and the carriage is moving in this direction. So effectively, the train cut the carriage in two, severing the front wheels from the rear wheels. The carriage was dragged beneath the train along with the 4 women for hundreds of feet and badly mutilating their bodies. Hence this grisly headline. The 4 women were naturally killed outright. The carriage driver had been thrown from the carriage with the impact and died a few hours later. Now, witnesses said that the train could be seen approaching from a distance, but the coach driver did not properly gauge the speed of the train or its distance or his ability to get across the crossing. And as a result, Emma Peters Roloff, this was buried in this grave here in Forest Home Cemetery, along with Joanna Behrens Roloff, Clara Dressel, Minnie Potoff, and Frank Newman, the driver, 39-year-old Frank Newman, was also killed, and he was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, the very cemetery that they had left just a short while before. Now, one of the other things that this sort of highlights is the fact, particularly in the early years of the railway, up to 1910, 1915, people didn't understand the speed of these trains, how fast they accelerated, how quickly they went, and so on. And so you frequently read about these accidents where people underestimated how quickly that train was going to get to that crossing, that intersection. And when people attempted to beat the train, they were often killed, just like in this case. Or in this case, it was just poor judgment. So we continued to move west. Now we're in Hillside at Wolf Road. Again, Wolf Road was the site of many deadly accidents over the years. And this was a double crossing with the Chicago Great Western as well as the CA&E that went over Wolf Road. And it was a grade level crossing for years and years until 1937 when they finally put a bridge over it. That bridge is still there today. You go over it on the Illinois Prairie Path. But that finally put an end to the carnage that was going on at this intersection. And this is just one of those stories. After attending a family reunion in Cicero, 2 men and 4 women were driving north in an automobile along Wolf Road on their way home during the early evening of Saturday, March 15th, 1924. As they approached the Wolf Road crossing of the CA&E and the Chicago Great Western, they passed over the crossing. Their automobile was hit squarely by a westbound CA&E train moving at 50 miles an hour. The force of the collision was so great that their vehicle was thrown 100 feet to the west, and you can see what was left of the car. Look how open that is back at that time. Again, this is 1924. Several hundred feet southwest of this intersection at the crossing was St. Domitillo's Church, and a benefit dance was in progress. The body of one of the victims, Irene Williams, was thrown to within a few feet of the people walking towards the benefit dance. Shattered glass from the collision made it all the way to the church grounds, several hundred feet away. So killed in this accident were Irene Williams, age 21 of St. Louis, Cecilia Klepepko, age 19 of Cicero, Anthony Peel, age 35 of Cicero. So that were these three people here: Irene Williams, Anthony Peel, and Cecilia Klepepko, all died in this particular accident. The Irene Williams and Peel were buried in St. Peter and Paul Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. Now we get to Elmhurst and York Street. Again, multiple accidents at York Street over the years. You wouldn't know it to look at it today, but in the early evening of June 29th, 1918, a 30-year-old Charles E. Jones of Chicago was driving a motor truck heavily laden with 8 tons of crushed stone. As he approached the AE&C and Chicago Great Western crossings from the north along York Street in Elmhurst. 2 passengers in the cab with him. The truck did everything correctly. It approached the crossing slowly, came to a full stop before crossing over the Chicago Great Western track. At that time, this is 1918, there were no warning bells, gates, or guards at the crossing. It was just, you're on your own as you cross over. So as he approached the AE&C crossing that was right in front of him after the Chicago Great Western crossing, the night was clear, so visibility was good. However, there were 4 train cars on the siding of the Chicago Great Western that obstructed the view looking east along the AE&C line. And so the truck proceeded forward. And as it did, a 2-car westbound AE&C train was traveling at 60 miles an hour, came right upon them. The train cars were filled with passengers heading home for the evening. So this was just about dinner time on that particular evening. 2 of the passengers in the truck jumped to safety just in time, but Charles Jones was still at the wheel when the train collided with his vehicle. The truck was thrown out of the way like it was nothing because this 2-car train was traveling at such a high rate of speed. However, the cargo, the load of stone that it was carrying, slammed through the front end of the lead train car, literally burying the passengers in stone. Both of the train cars derailed, and they traveled along the tracks for roughly 600 feet before coming to a stop. So the amount of momentum of this train was enormous. The motorman was probably killed instantly and hadn't even applied the brakes when it hit the vehicle. The York AE&C station, which as many of you might know, was on the southwest side of that intersection with the IPP. That was almost swept away by the force of the collision, and that was a brick building, as some of you might remember. Killed in that particular accident, and there were 6 people killed, were Major Robert E. Brooks, age 46, of Glen Ellen. He was a recruiting officer for the U.S. Army, this fellow here. Harry Westfall of Elgin, William F. Miller of Little Rock, Arkansas, Robert W. Dunlap of Wheaton, he was the motorman. Fred Skoning, who was a captain in the U.S. Army, on his way home from Fort Dodge in Iowa when this accident occurred. The train conductor lost an eye, and several other passengers were severely injured. Charles Jones, the truck driver, died a few days later. The burials were for Brooks was in the Glen Oak Cemetery in West Chicago. Westfall, Miller, and Skonig were buried in Bluff City Cemetery in Elgin, Dunlap at the Big Rock Welsh Cemetery in Kane County, and finally Jones was buried in Forest Home Cemetery in Forest Park. So that pretty horrific crash. 6 people died. Then we get to Westmore Avenue in Lombard. At 10 a.m. in the morning of October 21st, 1922, several workers for the CA&E Railway were in a work truck on their way to a job site. Peter Marks, age 31, was driving the truck, and perhaps he was distracted by one of the other people in the truck. It's hard to say. But in any event, he pulled the work truck out onto the Westmore Avenue crossing just when a westbound CA&E train traveling at close to 60 miles an hour hit them squarely while passing over the crossing. The men were hurled for a distance of tens of feet. The truck was completely demolished. It's not clear if Marks saw the approaching train. The crossing is believed to have had a clear view in both directions, as you can see from this photograph taken in the 1920s. Again, it may have been a case where the driver was simply distracted momentarily when they passed over the crossing. Killed were Peter Marks of West Chicago, John Joseph Peters of Aurora, Victor Cioni of West Chicago, Charles Tim of West Chicago, and at least a few others were seriously injured in the accident. So again, terrible, terrible accidents that occurred at these crossings. So that brings us to Wheaton, College Avenue. So this is the one we were talking about earlier. College Avenue is another one of those oblique intersections. Here's the CA&E, and here's Hill Avenue, which leads into College Avenue right here. And there were many, many cases of accidents at this crossing over the years. This is just one example. In the early morning of August 3rd, 1928, James Blackburn, age 29 of Glen Ellen, was driving to work at 6:30 in the morning, driving north and approaching the College Avenue crossing in Wheaton. Now, Blackburn worked at the Lakewood Golf Club, also known as St. Andrews. Remember, St. Andrews Golf Course had 2 golf courses. One of them was Lakewood, hence Lakewood Station and St. Andrews Station along the Elgin line. So another tie-in to the Elgin line, in case you're wondering. The crossing's warning bells were flashing, and Blackburn only noticed a CA&E train pulling into the College Avenue station from the west. So he saw this way. Where am I? Oh, here we go. He saw the train coming in from the west to stop at the flag stop at the College Avenue station. That's what he saw. And he reasoned that with the train stopping, he could safely pull around. So he started to go across the crossing while the train was at picking up passengers, dropping off passengers at the College Avenue station. But unfortunately, there was a train coming from the other direction as well, which is often the case, and people don't look in both directions necessarily. A westbound CA&E train moving at 35 miles an hour, unseen by Blackburn, collided with his vehicle, hurling his automobile against an electric signal tower nearby and killing him instantly. He left a wife and 2 sons, and he's buried at the Forest Hill Cemetery in Glen Ellen. So this is another example of the type of accident that would occur. Even with the warning bells, people would assume, they'd see one train and assume that was it, and they'd go forward, and then boom, there's another train coming in the other direction that they didn't see. And that's why we included some of these, by the way, just to sort of demonstrate the different ways that people were fooled. Now, that brings us to the Wheaton station, and one wouldn't think that a serious train accident might occur at the Wheaton main station, the hub of the CA&E, where the trains generally moved fairly slowly, but indeed there were some serious accidents there. William J. Sullivan, age 48, from Elgin, a conductor for the CA&E, was called into work early in the morning of May 14, 1945, foregoing his usual start time, which was around noon. He had been on the job as a conductor for several months, starting in autumn of the previous year. So he hadn't been a conductor for a long time when this happened. His first train that morning was going to take him from Wheaton out to Aurora. So I think, as many of you know, the westbound tracks were on the north side, and the train would have been boarded right over here. So this train is westbound, either heading to Elgin or Aurora. Perhaps he felt a little bit groggy as a result of working the morning shift instead of his usual noon shift. But as he boarded the train, he missed the boarding step. And as the train just started to move forward, and as a result of that misstep, it caused him to slip beneath the train. And just as the train started to move, he was crushed beneath the wheels and killed immediately. He's buried in St. Gall Cemetery, Elburn, in Kane County, Illinois. So even the simplest moment of distraction results in the death of somebody. Now, we wanted to leave on a little more positive note. We've been telling you tales of horror and tragedy all along the CA&E Railway, so we wanted to tell you of a more uplifting story, especially as we head into the Yuletide and holiday season, after Halloween, of course. So we spotted this story in the course of doing our research, and it's about Ms. Helen Walter Munsert, and she certainly ought to be considered one of the most energetic, intelligent, accomplished women that Wheaton has ever produced. Helen Walter Munsert was an attorney based in Chicago whose husband, Kenneth, was a veteran and physician. She graduated from the Chicago-Kent College of Law as valedictorian in 1935. Eventually became director of the Chicago chapter of the Interstate Commerce Commission. This was unheard of in the 1950 timeframe. She served admirably for many years. She also held many other important positions related to professional associations and the Chicago Bar Association. So this is a very accomplished person. Another strange tie-in, she and her husband resided at the Hubbard Manor along Weesbrook Road, which some of you might remember is the place where the Stewart family lived when their baby daughter was killed tragically in 1913. So Ms. Munsert was a daily commuter on the CA&E train, where she would take the train from Wheaton to Wells Street every working day as part of her job. And as part of her boundless energy and unbridled enthusiasm, to steal a line from Seinfeld, on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1947, Helen Munsert decided to spread some Christmas joy to her fellow passengers on her regular CA&E train, car number 458, that she typically took to her office in downtown Chicago every morning, captained by her usual motorman, whose name was William Mosier, or sometimes called Tom Mosier. So she boarded the train with a fully trimmed Christmas tree, placed it in the aisle, gave William Mosier a Christmas gift, and then handed out candy and cookies to all the passengers on the train. The inspired passengers soon took to caroling as they traveled eastward into Chicago. And although the train took the usual amount of time to get there, all the riders agreed that it was the shortest trip to Chicago they could remember. Mosier, the motorman, is said to have enjoyed the party and caroling as well. For his part, he would pull the train whistle every time they came to the part in Jingle Bells of One Horse Open Sleigh. So interestingly, if you visit the Fox River Trolley Museum in South Elgin, there you'll see car 458 in all of its glory, fully renovated. So it's the very train that was talked about in this newspaper article from 1947. So if you want to experience anything like that, go to the Trolley Museum, and you can ride on that very same train that is talked about in this article.
And sing carols if you want.
And sing carols.
And sing carols if you want. If they might let you on with a Christmas tree.
So just on a slightly more serious note, there are still accidents that occur along the CA&E right-of-way to this day, along of course, the Illinois Prairie Path. Pedestrians, cyclists usually take it out the brunt of the accidents from collisions with cars. They've made many improvements to the Illinois Prairie Path over the years, such as pedestrian bridges, which have greatly improved the safety of many intersections, but there still remain many dangerous intersections along the path. And we've certainly seen them as we've ridden the Illinois Prairie Path. So if you're driving an automobile, please be careful as you pass by these intersections, whether this trail or any other trail. Watch for both pedestrians and cyclists emerging from either side. And if you're walking or cycling, please behave responsibly and cross safely. We've seen people do stupid things on that end as well. So just a plea for people to think about all of the death and tragedy that have occurred along this right of way over the many decades. And we just don't want any more people injured along this path. So ending up, there are many great sources of information regarding CA&E history. You can start with our videos, of course, on our YouTube channel, Be Historic. There's also some excellent websites such as the trolleydodger.com or thegreatthirdrail.org, as well as some social media sites that focus exclusively on the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railway. Some great books as well that we've got listed here, as well as periodical and places to visit. The DuPage County History Museum has a new exhibit on the CA&E, very well worth seeing. The Clintonville Station in South Elgin, the Fox River Trolley Museum in South Elgin. Make a day of it, go to both. And the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois. So there are many places you can go to get a lot more information and learn a lot more about the CA&E. So this is the part where we do questions, comments, and great thoughts. Anybody want to say anything? Yes.
There seems like there was a rural areas versus more congested areas where the amount of the numbers of accidents pretty much equal in both areas, or was that kind of hard to figure out location?
That's an interesting question. I don't think we did an analysis based on location like that, but that's an interesting observation between rural and urban.
Want to take more chances if it's rural, maybe more careful if it's in the city, or just too many people?
Right. Right, but I think you can see from some of the examples we put up that even on the rural locations, like 4 people killed in one accident and so on. I think there certainly were more accidents in the urban areas, that's for certain. And we talked very little about the suicides that took place along the CA&E and A&C. There were quite a few of those, actually. Did that answer your question or no?
Yes.
Sort of. Other questions, comments? Yes.
The principal who committed suicide, where did you say he was buried?
Metamora, in Woodford County, Illinois. Yeah, it's a very sad story. That filled the newspapers for a while after he committed suicide, and it seemed to be a case of bullying by some of the students. He was perhaps younger than most high school principals would normally be, and I think that was part of the problem, perhaps. But yeah, a very sad story. And you just think about the desperation that people were driven to. So that's this, John.
You mentioned, I guess, a comment at oblique angles.
Yeah.
Was maybe effort made to make the roads come in perpendicularly, or was the money there for it?
Well, funny you should mention that, because there's a prime example of that in Wheaton, where there was an oblique angle for where the Plumondon station was. It went across Warrenville Road. Warrenville Road used to go straight through there. It wasn't, today it's Plumondon Road and Westbrook Road. Back then it was Warrenville Road, went straight through. They got rid of that intersection. I don't know if it was for safety reasons or because wealthy people lived to the west of the road, not clear which. But they got rid of the intersection, they diverted the road to Orchard Road, and now we've got that kludgy multi-right angle turns getting through that intersection. But there were a few examples of that, but not a lot. Yeah, the oblique angle, that was one common theme that emerged by looking at all these stories, is how many accidents occurred at those oblique intersections. I suppose part of it is because the Elgin and Aurora branches go off at angles from north-south. That probably was part of it. Were you going to say something, Joyce?
No, because I was trying to think of, a lot of them are still, even with the Prairie Path, like the Jewel Road crossing. The Prairie Path now comes straight and then you curve. The Prairie Path, they bring it straight up to Jewel, and then you have to make a right-hand turn on the sidewalks one. But if you followed it how it was, it's still the same oblique angle it was when the CA&E was there. So I don't, the most that's been done is in some instances there are now bridges, either for the roadway or for what is now pedestrians on the prairie path.
Yes, that's on under attack.
One of the corrections that Joyce mentioned on the Geneva spur, said that the training originated in St. Charles. Was that an extension of that came later?
We didn't really talk about it too much. I don't know if you can go back to that, but when in the maps from there, you see the CA&E or the Prairie Path now goes to Elgin, to Geneva, and to Batavia and Aurora. And then down the Fox River was the Fox River trolley system, which intermingled with this. We didn't cover a lot of this today, but the A&C or CA&E cars, each car could be driven independently. It had its own engine. They could hook up together and then they could separate. So in that instance, it was a trolley car that had originated in St. Charles and came down to Geneva. And then the Geneva terminal was on State Street. The Noble House restaurant now on State Street in Geneva is what the Geneva terminal was. And so it continued there, east. So that's how I should have explained it better, but that's how that car originated in St. Charles. You used to be able to go from Belvedere in the north all the way down to Yorkville, and you could get off the trolley system in Aurora, Batavia, Geneva, or Elgin. And then they still went out to DeKalb and up to Belvedere. So this was a huge, I don't know what the network at the time, and then eventually got broken off into different parts.
The trolley system was primarily on the west side, though?
It
was also.
Well, so the Fox River trolley system was primarily on the west side, yes. And what Joyce was just saying is that with the Geneva line, you could go west and it would make a right-hand turn and head north up to St. Charles. So you could take the Geneva line either east into Chicago, or you could head up north if you chose to. But for the most part, the Fox Valley line was on the west side of the river. There were a few changes to that.
Yeah, the Geneva terminal for the CA&E was on the west side of the river. So the Batavia was on the east side. And so, I misspoke there. You couldn't actually get to the trolley system from the Batavia terminal because it did end at Wilson Street on the east side. But for Geneva, you could go onto the Fox Valley trolley system.
Yes.
Was a rider in St. Charles once to go to Chicago, that there would be two different lines, would they just pay one fare, or would they have to,
Well, at that time, it was one train system at that
So
time.
the trolley system.
So they could take, yeah, sorry.
So the north-south trolley system that went from Elgin to Aurora, if they get, let's say they're let's say St. Charles, would they then take a trolley to the trolley system into Geneva or up into Elgin and then switch over to the CAE, or would?
Well, at that time, up through 1922, that was all one train system. Right, and I don't know, maybe somebody in the audience knows exactly how you could buy tickets, whether you could purchase a ticket all the way into Chicago, say, from St. Charles, or if you had to buy separate tickets. I don't know. Does anybody know? You?
The car, the C&E card would originate in St. Charles and go to Geneva and then switch tracks and go out. So, you could buy a ticket for the whole route.
Into Chicago. Okay.
But then the cars from Elgin to Aurora were sort of separate. And, they would just make that one.
Right, yeah, so the Fox Valley trolley system, as you said, would go as far north as Carpenters, would go all the way down to Yorkville. Yeah,
People in St. Charles had a choice of which car to get on.
yeah. And it was street boarding at St. Charles, correct?
What?
It was street boarding at
Yes.
St. Charles, yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? Great thoughts? Yes.
if no one got, no one used the flag stop to hail the train and it proceeded past, would they just go slower to the next station or they stop at the next station longer? How would they then put that time back on? You know what I mean?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if they just assumed that there'd be a certain number of stops for the entire trip from Elgin into Chicago. Just assume maybe half the stops, half the flag stops where people would be there or not. Maybe by experience, they might have done that. But does anybody know?
They'd only stop at the flag stops if somebody was there, or if somebody on the train had mentioned the conductor.
They want to get off.
At that stop.
But his question is, so let's say they passed by, there was no flag set.
Right.
For the train schedule point of view, would they go a little bit slower as a result of that, or would they keep
I
going?
don't think so. They had a stop at all the posted stops on the timetable.
Right.
But the flag stops were only if somebody was there. Like I said, they wanted to go off. The conductor would know this when he took the fares when the city broke the train, Wheaton, going up to Elgin, we want to get off the flag stop. He would go there, and by the time the engineer passed the last scheduled station, he'd blow, give him 3 rings on the communicating board. The guy would acknowledge stop at the next station. So the Morgan didn't have to necessarily know they were going to make the stop there, the conductor did.
Mhm.
But he only stopped if he saw the flag up and there was somebody there.
Right. Thank you. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
More or less? Yeah. Any other questions, comments? One more.
Bicycling, imagine, maybe Main Street Lombard, you're on Edison, GW, or CA, Prairie Path, and you're, there's motorists see, I guess, yellow diamond-shaped signs making them aware of bicyclists. Do they have to stop, or is it just to make awareness yield, or sometimes if I get too close to the street, motorists will stop and, oh no, you go, right?
Right. They do that dance between the cyclist and
No,
the car driver, yeah. No, we've done that many times. I'm just trying to think, I don't know offhand if that sign means to stop. Are you talking about the flashing lights?
Or yellow color, bicycle crossing.
Yeah, the yellow, they may not have to stop, but I do know in Illinois, pedestrians and I think bicyclists technically have the right of way. So if a motorist hits a pedestrian or a cyclist, the motorist will be ticketed. I don't know, even if they intentionally jumped out in front of you, technically, they'll be, it's not like that in all states though. But yeah, we've noticed that sometimes it's awkward because like one car will stop, but it's a 2-lane road and you don't know if the other people coming in the outer lane are gonna stop. So we won't head out and then the people get annoyed, especially if they're on the other side. But I'm not going into that other lane unless I know that car is stopped.
I think it sort of goes back to, do you want me right or do you want me dead?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you technically might have the right of way, but, you could be dead. So, other questions? Okay, we'll take one more.
Throughout your research, did you ever have any like firsthand accounts with, or you actively contacted anyone in the families or anyone reached out to you? There was that one case where the guy survived the crash.
The short answer is no. We did not
Yeah.
talk directly with anybody who was a survivor of an accident. We did hear indirectly about a few people. For instance, we heard about a young man, a boy who was up towards Elgin. He had tripped on the third rail and severely burned his foot, and he had to have his foot amputated. So apparently he's still alive. And we heard about him through a third party. The story about the Hillborns at Elgin, or at the Elgin line at Lincoln Avenue, that was brought to us by a person who was familiar with the story, who was alive when it took place. And she was surprised we hadn't talked about it in our video. So it was such a horrific accident. But those are the only 2 cases where we had indirect discussions with folks.
One question.
Okay, one
Well,
more.
this is in total, from the time that this was all constructed to land, what was the total amount of accidents? I know that's probably a big broad act, but it must be total, but in total.
We'd have to go back and look at what we were able to collect, and like I said, I think that's underreported by probably 20-25% or more.
Yeah,
But we'd have to go back and
I
look at
know
it.
that's, you know.
It was a large number. It was in the
Right.
hundreds.
They're very depressing, you can tell just listening, they're very depressing going through it too. That's why the first year that we started this series, we thought we would do all 5 branches, and we did Elgin and Geneva. And we were so depressed, we're like, that's it for this year. So
Yeah,
we'll do
it's
one a
very
year.
depressing.
It's depressing doing the research, doing the writing, doing the filming. We have to, learn it and go out and do it. And you're just going over and over and over this. And yeah, we don't want to end up one of the casualties because we do this.
So when I tried to look at the footage online, I see that you guys have done presentations before on tragedy.
Right. Yeah, we've, as Joyce said, we've done a series on 4 of the branches so far. We haven't gotten to the main line. Maybe we'll do that next year, but there's just so many. And like Joyce said, it takes its toll on you psychologically, going through these. Just, I can tell from your reaction how pressing it is to hear all of these very sad stories in the course of one evening. Believe me, I think we fully understand.
When we just recently published the Batavia one and the story about that Carl Frey, I barely made it through the recordings on that. I was bawling my eyes out in the room doing, listening to think about this poor 7-year-old boy and his parents. I got to start crying now. So it's very difficult at times. Certain stories just hit you.
Yeah. Okay, do we have time for one more or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this is just kind of an aside, but if you listen to the radio traffic reports for Metro, you'll find that the number of accidents has not decreased at all. There's a tremendous number of them.
Yeah. Well, and along those same lines, we still see the same stupid behavior that was discussed in some of these accidents. Just about 2 weeks ago, we were at West Street in downtown Wheaton. And there were a line of cars waiting for the light to change heading north along West Avenue. And
we were on our bikes.
We were on our bikes, and as well as several other pedestrians waiting at the corner for the lights to change. And then the Metro bells started ringing, the gates started coming down. And a car that was about 3 or 4 back in line heading north, the black SUV, gunned the engines, went out in an opposing traffic lane, and flew across just barely making it under the crossing gates. And we just looked at each other, what an utterly irresponsible act. Not necessarily because he might have gotten killed or she might have gotten killed, but several other people could have been collateral damage. There were all these pedestrians standing on the corner, could have gotten injured or killed as a result of that. Not to mention the train. And that was just 2 weeks ago. And, I'm sure all of you have stories about such things as well. So it's still amazing that people think that they can roll the dice and, I'll beat that train. So anyway, I think we're getting the signal.
Thank you all for coming.